Beneath the official history lies a labyrinth of sealed corridors, where pages were torn from the record and voices silenced before they could speak. Shadows of forgotten operations stretch across continents, marked only by coded whispers and vanished convoys. What remains is not certainty, but residue, burned files, erased names, and transmissions no one admits receiving. Tonight, we step into that darkness, following the faint signals of secrets designed never to be uncovered. In January 1944, as the tide of the Second World War tilted decisively against the Axis powers, a seemingly obscure British naval operation was launched in the Southern Hemisphere under the innocuous cover name Operation Tabarin. Officially, it was presented to Parliament as a scientific expedition designed to establish permanent bases in the Antarctic for meteorological observation and to assert British sovereignty over contested territories. In reality, Admiralty files later stamped "Most Secret" reveal that Tabarin carried with it a far darker and more strategic mandate to secure potential Axis routes of resupply through the South Atlantic, particularly the rumoured use of isolated islands by the Kriegsmarine as refueling points for U-boats. Among the vessels dispatched was a small escort convoy under Rear Admiral Walter Godfrey de Eath, sailing south from Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands with orders to patrol near Deception Island, an extinct volcanic caldera long used as a whaling station. The convoy, consisting of the armed trawler HMS William Scoresby, the corvette HMS Carnation, and two requisitioned merchant vessels carrying supplies and equipment, left port on the 21st of February 1944 and entered the Weddell Sea by the 24th. Radio. Logs recorded at Stanley that morning showed routine position updates until 17:10 hours, when the convoy reported visibility poor, barometer falling, proceeding under reduced speed. After that transmission, silence. For 3 days, the South Atlantic Command in Montevideo attempted to raise the William Scoresby and Carnation, diverting a Catalina flying boat from Rio Grande, Brazil, to search the designated patrol grid. On the 28th of February, an Argentine commercial whaler reported oil slicks near the approaches to Deception Island, along with what appeared to be 2 charred lifeboats, their wooden frames blackened and warped. Photographs taken by the whaler's crew, later seized under the Foreign Office's Official Secrets Act, showed naval-issue life preservers marked with British ciphers, and in one case a boot bearing the initials JWG, believed to belong to Sub-Lieutenant John William Green, an officer attached to the William Scoresby. Strangely, no bodies were recovered, no wreckage of the ships themselves was ever located, and Admiralty files contain only a terse note: convoy lost, probable severe weather, no survivors. Yet years later, a different narrative surfaced in intelligence intercepts. A decrypted Enigma message, preserved in the Bletchley Park archive under code reference CX-MSS 1489T, indicated that in late February 1944, 2 Type MoineD-2 U-boats, U-859 and U-864, were ordered to rendezvous at a southern station to transfer special cargo designated Seehund. Though the U-boat war diary for that period remains fragmentary, researchers discovered that both submarines had been carrying materials critical to experimental radar-absorbent coatings and advanced torpedo guidance systems bound for Japanese allies. Some intelligence officers concluded that the British convoy may have intercepted or stumbled upon the transfer. A marginal note in one MI6 report from March 1946 even speculated that loss of Tabarin convoy consistent with hostile action, possible sabotage via magnetic torpedoes of advanced type. Official British accounts, however, never acknowledged combat. Survivors' families were told the ships had succumbed to sudden storms in the Antarctic convergence. Yet the Deception Island coordinates, re-examined by hydrographic surveys in the 1970s, showed no wrecks on the seabed where weather loss was alleged. Instead, local accounts collected from Norwegian whalers at Grytviken suggest they saw unusual nocturnal activity in late February 1944. Distant flares, muffled detonations, and a silhouette of what was described as a large black vessel without markings, accompanied by smaller craft. Whether this vessel was a disguised German auxiliary cruiser, a supply ship, or something else entirely remains unresolved. Operation Tabarin's surviving documentation was sealed for 50 years under the Public Records Act, and even when released, entire sections of the logbooks from HMS Carnation were absent, replaced by pages marked "withdrawn for national security reasons." Some scholars argue that the missing convoy was deliberately expunged from history, a casualty not only of war, but of the clandestine struggle to conceal technological spoils destined for the Cold War. The incident's mention in Admiralty War Diary Volume 2 is a single sentence: "Convoy en route to South Shetlands presumed lost at sea." Beyond that, silence. Today, the lost Tabarin convoy remains one of the least explained maritime disappearances of World War II, remembered only in fragmentary cables, blacked-out reports, and the whispered suggestion that somewhere in the Antarctic, Britain and Germany crossed paths in a struggle neither side wanted revealed. Whether they were swallowed by weather, torpedoes, or secrecy, the fate of those ships remains locked in the ice of forgotten war. On the night of April 9, 1945, after 3 months of relentless siege, Königsberg, once the proud capital of East Prussia, fell to the Red Army's Third Belarusian Front. Soviet reports described a city reduced to rubble, its medieval streets pulverized by artillery, its defenders either dead or scattered. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky declared victory, and Moscow radio broadcast news of Königsberg's total liberation. Yet in the days that followed, an anomaly began to haunt Soviet signals intelligence. At a listening station near Kaunas, a detachment of the 131st Independent Radio Battalion intercepted a series of encrypted transmissions on frequencies long associated with Luftwaffe command nets. The intercept operators logged them under the designation Signal Phantom, noting the first burst at 2:17 hours on April 12th. Despite the city being firmly in Soviet hands, the source triangulated consistently to coordinates beneath the ruins of Königsberg Castle, a structure whose vaulted cellars and medieval tunnels had partially survived the bombardment. The content of the messages, once decrypted using Soviet Enigma replicas seized in Poland, revealed fragments of operational language, references to Project Morgenlicht, Führerbefehl 17, and cryptic mentions of Gerate C and transfer by rail. What disturbed the intercept analysts was not merely the timing, but the precision. The senders adhered to Luftwaffe signal discipline, using current cipher keys known to have been in effect during the final weeks of the war. Orders from Moscow mandated further interception. Between April 12th and April 28th, no fewer than 16 transmissions were recorded. Each became shorter, more urgent, before ceasing altogether. Then, on May 1st, the Third Belarusian Front's political department filed a sealed memorandum to the Stavka, claiming that the transmissions had been an enemy deception. Yet, in 1963, a retired GRU officer, Colonel Sergei Smirnov, privately published memoirs in Paris in which he described being present at a search of Königsberg Castle in the summer of 1945. According to Smirnov, NKVD units discovered a steel-reinforced chamber accessible only through collapsed catacombs. Inside, they recovered radio equipment connected to a power source independent of the city grid, as well as crates bearing Luftwaffe requisition stamps dated March 1945. Among the documents seized, Smirnov claimed, were technical diagrams labeled Morgenlicht, Reichsluftfahrtministerium, Berlin Adlershof. These diagrams were never acknowledged by Soviet archives. Western historians dismiss Smirnov as unreliable, yet fragments of his testimony echo obscure references in Allied records. A declassified OSS technical report from July 1945, unearthed at the US National Archives under Catalogue RG 226, describes Soviet reluctance to share details of captured Luftwaffe long-range weapons experiments, codenamed Morgenlicht, with the marginalia noting possible continuation under Russian supervision. British files likewise hint at suspicions. An Air Ministry memorandum, AIR 42619, observes unverified Soviet claims regarding German radar and guidance systems recovered in Königsberg, exact nature unknown. Even within the Warsaw Pact, secrecy prevailed. In 1977, Polish Air Force historian Tadeusz Rolski recorded an account from a veteran signals officer who had been stationed in Vilnius during the Königsberg offensive. The officer insisted that, weeks after the city's fall, his unit was still directed to monitor a phantom station believed to be coordinating the evacuation of technical personnel to the west. The station ceased abruptly after May 9th, coinciding with Germany's unconditional surrender. Speculation persists that Project Morgenlicht referred to a late-war Luftwaffe initiative to adapt long-range missiles with rudimentary radar guidance, an effort perhaps intended for deployment against Soviet assembly points along the Vistula or even targets deeper inside Russia. If such technology was indeed captured in Königsberg, it may have provided the Soviets with a basis for post-war advances in cruise missile development. Yet the secrecy remains absolute. Russian military archives list Königsberg files under restricted category Osobowej ważności, of special importance, sealed until at least 2045. No public evidence of Morgenlicht has ever been released. What endures is the unsettling fact that for nearly 3 weeks after Königsberg's fall, signals consistent with active Luftwaffe command stations were heard by trained operators, logged and authenticated, only to be dismissed as phantoms. Were they remnants of a desperate garrison, automated transmissions from unmanned relay stations, or the echo of a weapons program too sensitive for either East or West to acknowledge? The silence of the archives suggests the latter. Today, Königsberg is Kaliningrad, a fortified exclave bristling with missiles and radars, its medieval past long buried under Soviet concrete. Yet in the ruins of the old castle, beneath layers of rubble and secrecy, the unanswered question lingers. What precisely was transmitted from beneath the city, and why did both victors and vanquished ensure that no definitive record would ever emerge? In the chaotic final weeks of the war, as the German Reich disintegrated under simultaneous Allied and Soviet offensives, Czechoslovakia became the setting for one of the most curious intelligence seizures of 1945, an episode later scrubbed from both American and Soviet wartime accounts. On the 5th of May 1945, US Army elements of the 16th Armored Division entered the outskirts of Plzeň, part of General George S. Patton's Third Army advance, liberating the Škoda Works complex, one of the largest arms manufacturers in Europe. What the soldiers encountered was not merely the ruins of a bombed-out factory, but a hastily abandoned Gestapo safe house located on the premises. Inside, an OSS Technical Intelligence Detachment discovered metal trunks containing rolls of microfilm, carefully catalogued under Reichssicherheitshauptamt reference numbers and marked Nur für Sondergebrauch, for special use only. These films contained coded reports on production quotas, experimental weapons tests, and, most disturbingly, documentation of human experiments conducted on forced laborers within Škoda's underground facilities. Testimonies recorded by local Czech partisans described entire rail wagons sealed from the outside, departing the factory grounds at night under SS guard, their sides bearing both the Reichsadler insignia and stenciled red stars, as if prepared for handover to Soviet units. Such anomalies suggested that by April 1945, elements of the Wehrmacht or SS had already begun clandestine transfers to the advancing Red Army, possibly as part of a covert deal to secure personnel or technology. The OSS files, labeled under CIA's internal code Prague files, were immediately forwarded to the US Army's Technical Industrial Intelligence Committee, TIIC. A surviving debriefing sheet, TIIC PLZ-8, recorded experimental metallurgy processes, unconventional propellants, involuntary human testing protocols. Within 2 months, however, the trail went cold. A directive dated the 12th of July 1945, identified only as Directive X 422, ordered that the Prague files be removed from TIIC custody and transferred to Washington under the classification above, top secret. Researchers have since uncovered only fragments. In 1952, a blurred photocopy surfaced in KGB training manuals captured by West German intelligence. The copy contained half-legible references to Testraya Gamma and Subterranean, facility beneath Beron Hills. The Czech state archives hold no trace of these experiments, only vague references in wartime correspondence about special transports moving east in May 1945. Eyewitnesses in Plzeň later told oral historians that, in the days following liberation, American officers supervised the removal of dozens of crates from the Škoda works, loaded onto C-47 transports departing for France. When the Red Army occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia in early June, those same sites were sealed off, and Soviet military police conducted their own excavations. But by then, the documentation had vanished. Official histories from both superpowers omitted the episode. US accounts described the liberation of Škoda in purely tactical terms, while Soviet publications emphasized the role of Red Army sacrifice, erasing the American interlude altogether. It was only decades later, when fragments of OSS archives were declassified, that researchers noticed anomalies: missing file numbers in the Prague section, references to a suppression order, and heavily redacted cables between Washington and London discussing shared custody of Škoda findings. Some historians speculate that the Prague files contained evidence of joint Nazi-Soviet arrangements in the war's final days, evidence too politically dangerous to acknowledge during the early Cold War, when the narrative of irreconcilable hostility between the two powers had to be maintained. Others believe the suppression centered on the nature of the human experiments, which may have included chemical agents or early rocketry fuels tested directly on camp inmates. The blurred microfilm copy hints at chemical compositions resembling those later used in Soviet high-energy propellants of the 1950s, suggesting a direct transfer of knowledge. Survivors of Škoda's underground camps, interviewed secretly in 1946 by Czech exile organizations, described rooms filled with chemical fumes, skeletal prisoners forced to handle powders that caused burns and blindness, and engineers in SS uniforms accompanied by translators who spoke Russian without accent. These testimonies were collected in exile newspapers but ignored by official post-war tribunals. Today, the full content of the Prague files remains locked away, most likely in vaults in Washington and Moscow, their pages either classified or destroyed. The episode has become a phantom in the history of World War II, a moment when victory blurred into secrecy, when Allied and Soviet agendas briefly intersected over technology too valuable to expose, and when the truth of what happened in the Škoda works was buried under Cold War necessity. All that remains are fragments, blurred reproductions, missing OSS catalogue numbers, and whispers of sealed wagons bearing both the Reich's eagle and the Red Army's star, disappearing into the shadows of history as the war itself came to a close. In the autumn of 1944, as Soviet forces pressed relentlessly toward the Baltic coast, Estonia became the scene of one of the war's least explained disappearances. Soviet records confirm that the 249th Rifle Division under the 8th Army of the WWII Leningrad Front was tasked with sweeping operations around the coastal town of Haapsalu, a key port and transit hub west of Tallinn. According to the division's own strength reports filed on the 18th of September, a battalion-sized element, approximately 780 men under Major Ivan Petrovich Sokolov, was detached for a special partisan clearance in the forests and marshes between Haapsalu and the Matsalu Bay estuary. Their assignment, described in operational order, number 42/8, was to intercept remnants of German 11th Infantry Division units believed to be evacuating toward the sea under protection of Kriegsmarine E-boats. What happened next remains buried beneath contradictory accounts. The battalion departed its bivouac at 4:30 on the 19th of September, equipped with 245 mm anti-tank guns, standard issue DP light machine guns, and a company of sappers. By evening, radio logs at Divisional HQ recorded a final transmission from Major Sokolov. Crossing Marsh sector, enemy activity noted, will pursue. No further signals were ever received. On the 23rd of September, reconnaissance detachments dispatched. To locate the battalion found only abandoned campfires and discarded ammunition crates. The official divisional report filed 2 days later classified the unit as missing in action, presumed destroyed. Yet evidence gathered from disparate sources suggests a far more disturbing picture. Local fishermen interviewed after the war recalled unusual naval movements in Matsalu Bay during those nights. Unmarked transports, flanked by German E-boats, loading cargoes under floodlights shielded by smoke generators. Survivors from nearby partisan groups later testified to seeing Soviet soldiers herded aboard barges by men in Wehrmacht engineer uniforms wearing chemical protection suits. Some described crates marked with black stenciling SS-Stoff and Tabun, designations consistent with German chemical weapons agents. Though impossible to verify, their stories align with fragmentary reports discovered decades later in NATO threat assessments, where an incident codenamed Red Mist was catalogued as a possible wartime use, or at least transfer, of nerve agents. Soviet archives remain ambiguous. The war diary of the 8th Army simply noted, "Battalion lost to enemy action in swamp sector. Search inconclusive." Yet a memorandum classified Osoboy Ważności, of special importance, declassified only briefly in the 1990s before withdrawal, mentioned possible chemical experimentation and disappearance of personnel in connection with Hapsalu. Western intelligence too took notice. A 1953 CIA memorandum, now partially released, referenced persistent rumors of Soviet loss of a battalion in 1944 linked to German chemical warfare evacuation from Estonia. The memo speculated that captured Soviet troops may have been used in testing environments, their fate concealed by Soviet command to prevent panic and avoid admitting vulnerabilities. No remains were ever discovered, no mass graves unearthed. Veterans of the 249th Division later admitted privately that an entire battalion had gone into the marshes and never come back. In 1961, the Estonian émigré press in Stockholm published an article claiming that tunnels beneath Haapsalu castle ruins had once been used to store sealed chemical canisters transferred onto U-boats. The allegation was dismissed as propaganda, yet NATO's own naval surveys of the Baltic in the 1980s identified scuttled containers south of Hiiumaa Island that tested positive for organophosphate traces. Consistent with Tabun disposal, the human dimension of the disappearance was quietly erased. Major Sokolov's name, along with those of his officers, never appeared in post-war commemorative lists, an omission noted by military historians comparing Soviet casualty rolls. Their families were informed simply that they had fallen in battle for the liberation of the Baltic. No specifics, no graves. In Haapsalu itself, locals recall Soviet trucks collecting debris from the shoreline well into the winter of 1944-45. Guarded by NKVD troops. One fisherman, interviewed in 1991, swore he saw corpses in Red Army uniforms drifting ashore near the bay, only to be removed by soldiers at gunpoint. To this day, Russian archives treat the battalion's fate as a lost file. Estonian archives, searched after independence in 1991, contain no documentation from the German side of such an encounter, suggesting deliberate destruction of records. The incident has become a historical blind spot, a missing unit, a vanished operation, a shadow over a war already filled with secrets. The lost battalion of Haapsalu lingers as a case of erasure, whether of chemical transfers, covert experimentation, or simple battlefield annihilation. No record has ever been allowed to settle the truth. All that remains are the absences. 780. Men whose march into the marshes of Estonia ended not in death recorded, but in disappearance. By April 1945, as Allied forces closed in on the heart of the Reich, Anglo-American planners in London had already prepared the framework for Germany's occupation. The plan bore the codename Operation Eclipse. Publicly, it was intended to establish military governance, disarm German forces, and secure industrial regions. But deep within Schaff, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Archives. Eclipse contained a series of special contingencies, drafted to secure sites believed to house Germany's most advanced weapons research. A memorandum dated the 9th of April 1945, signed by General Frederick Morgan, identified critical targets in Thuringia and Saxony that included underground facilities suspected of producing derivatives of the V-2 rocket and jet propulsion engines. Among the listed objectives was a complex near Sömmerda, north of Weimar, described in G2 intelligence files as Priority 1, Technical. When Patton's Third Army entered Thuringia in late April, elements of the US 80th Infantry Division advanced rapidly towards Sömmerda. Combat reports from the division's 318th Infantry Regiment confirm the capture of an SS convoy on the 11th of April, consisting of several trucks, 2 staff cars, and a rail transport prepared for evacuation. Witnesses noted that the convoy was heavily guarded by Waffen-SS personnel in black uniforms, some of whom surrendered only after sustaining heavy casualties. Inside the railcars, the Americans found crates marked with codes RLM Adlershof, Reich Air Ministry Research Center, and MW-46. Soldiers' after-action reports described sealed containers, tubular objects, and technical files. What precisely these crates contained has never been revealed. Within 48 hours, Patton's units received orders from Schaeff to withdraw from the Sömmerda sector and halt further advances eastward, in accordance with pre-arranged Allied demarcation lines. Yet the timing was conspicuous. Local testimonies collected after the war indicated that US trucks had already removed the captured convoy to an airfield near Erfurt, where C-47 transports departed under heavy security toward France. The official 80th Division War Diary, housed at Carlisle Barracks, lists only captured SS technical convoy contents forwarded to Higher HQ, sector evacuated per Schaaf directive. In the British National Archives, AIR 42368 contains a partially redacted memorandum from May 1945, referencing technical exploitation of Sömmerda capture transferred to Anglo-American custody under Eclipse priority. Entire paragraphs are blacked out, the margins stamped with the phrase, retention under 75-year rule. Meanwhile, Soviet reports from the First Ukrainian Front claimed that when their forces entered Sömmerda 2 weeks later, they found only empty warehouses and scorched administrative files. A bitter note from Marshal Ivan Konev to Stavka, preserved in Arga-Aspy archive, accused the Western Allies of plundering German secrets in violation of agreed occupation zones. The Americans, for their part, denied that any advanced research materials had been removed. Yet the coincidence that, within months, US military laboratories at Wright Field began receiving an influx of German engineers under Operation Paperclip suggests otherwise. Several names connected to the Reich's rocket and jet programs, Hans Kammler, Walter Dornberger, appear repeatedly in declassified paperclip rosters, their files sanitized of war crimes references. Operation Eclipse itself, when released in 1991, appeared innocuous. Detailed maps of occupation zones, orders for civil administration, and transport timetables. Absent, however, were the technical annexes, listed in inventories but marked as destroyed 1946. A discrepancy noted by historians is that annex numbers jump irregularly, leaving unexplained gaps where the Sömmerda targets should have been catalogued. A further anomaly emerged in a 1957 US Army restricted publication, History of Technical Intelligence in Europe, which briefly mentioned a convoy seizure near Sömmerda, April 1945, containing jet propulsion and missile prototypes, before later editions omitted the reference entirely. Whether coincidence or censorship, the erasure fits a pattern: capture, exploitation, suppression. For the people of Thuringia, the episode left visible scars. Local farmers recalled being ordered at gunpoint to abandon their land for weeks in May 1945 while foreign troops combed the fields. One villager swore he saw dismantled rocket fuselages loaded onto US trucks. Another remembered SS prisoners being separated from other captives, escorted westward under American guard rather than transferred to Soviet custody. None of these men were ever seen again. By summer, the US officially withdrew from Surmadar, handing the region over to Soviet administration. Yet the most valuable spoils were already gone, folded into classified American programs that would shape the Cold War arms race. Official histories reduce Operation Eclipse to a bureaucratic occupation plan, but the surviving traces tell a more unsettling story. That amid Germany's collapse, the Allies competed not only for victory, but for possession of technologies so advanced they could not be acknowledged publicly. The erased pages, the missing annexes, the blacked-out memoranda all point to a truth deliberately buried. Operation Eclipse did not simply plan Germany's occupation. It orchestrated the removal of its darkest scientific legacy into shadows where no accountability would ever reach. The war ended on paper, yet in the margins it never truly stopped. Buried convoys, erased battalions, and files stamped out of existence linger like scars no archive can heal. Somewhere between truth and invention, the silence grows heavier than the facts themselves. What was hidden is not gone. It waits in locked rooms, in ocean depths, in nameless graves. And if we listen closely, the past still speaks, through echoes we were never meant to hear.